The first colonization or immigration started, according to her story, 1882. We're going to fact check with some other things that we have over here to see if that's really when it started. But if that's when it started, that's a long time before most people understand the justification for Israel as a state in the first place. They think it's because of Hitler in World War II that this all had to happen, when really there was a plan almost 100 years prior to that in place. And we're going to go through some of the evidence and artifacts. And then when we follow it all up, I also brought this book. I found it, Tony. I found the witness tree. And there's just a little
Yeah,
piece of
sure.
history in here given to us through an interview with with a Mossad agent that was there on how all this pops off. And it might also change for the people who are conscious and conscientious. It might change their perspective. And for people who are, on red team, blue team, I'm not sure it does a whole lot for them, because they're wearing those jerseys likely not because they didn't have the opportunity to take it off, but because they like wearing it. So we'll just
It
give people the freedom of choice. Things exist. They
should
can be
be
measured.
noted as well, because of course that lady would leave out another key feature of uh emigration that took place in Europe, and that would be, and this comes from not myself but from Foreign Affairs,
Oh my goodness, the
called the
CFR.
Havara Agreement, where, as we understand it, the transfer agreement, the
Yes.
untold story of the secret pact between the Third Reich and Jewish Palestine. Hitler's early anti-Jewish measures provoked worldwide efforts at a boycott of German goods, a measure that would have injured a still precarious economy. Jews orchestrated these efforts at a boycott, but hesitated over whether it would inflame or moderate German anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, Zionist leadership in the Third Reich agreed on arrangements whereby German Jews could emigrate to Palestine under somewhat more favorable financial conditions, whereby German trade with Palestinian Jewry would increase. In turn, majority Zionists, as against the revisionists, backed away from the boycott. The author documents the divisions within Jewry, insisting that the Zionists put their cause German immigration to Palestine ahead of the possible protection of Jews via more militant economic measures. Although shockingly deficient in its grasp of German developments, Black explicates, I think that's the name of the author, the several Jewish positions, and seems to argue both that an early boycott might have succeeded and that the Zionists were the coldest realist, perhaps the only realist of the period, end quote. Now, there's different debates. One you could find on, for example, on this website, Holocaust Encyclopedia, that over 340,000 Jews immigrated from Germany and Austria. Now, that woman said that Walkop, I think that's how you pronounce his name, that's this man here, author Grenfell Walcop, he was able to immigrate 200,000, 220,000, I think was. So I'm just noting that she's leaving out a big piece of the immigration here, a
Yeah.
huge piece. She talks about just the relationship between um uh
That's my
Serbs,
point. There's huge
the
pieces
British
missing.
soldier and colonial administrator. So they talk
Yeah.
about the British side, which is already favorable to Zionism, but she's not talking about the unfavorable side, that'd be the Nazi regime and their actual, at least initial, it was a forced migration, but there was a situation where they had an agreement where they could deposit their assets and they would obtain the same value when they got to Israel. And that seemed to have been maintained until I think
See also
1941.
Corbett report. He did a
Yeah.
whole special on that.
And that does not justify. Again, this comes from the Foreign Affairs, and also I
No,
looked at the Holocaust Encyclopedia. I'm not drawing from any sort of crazy sources here.
no.
It's also
Here's
a major
another.
point of where some of the major European Jewish population was able to relocate to give the majority, or at least not majority, but they were trying to gain a majority against the indigenous Palestinian population that is Coptic Christians, that is various forms of Islamists that are, some are secularists. Like there's a whole hodgepodge of different not competing. They weren't competing. They weren't at war with one another. They were just different
Until
ethnicities, different
some English
religions,
people
different whatever.
got there.
Right. Until some English people got there.
All right.
Exactly fucking
Here's my
right.
next piece of evidence.
Damn.
This is out of chronological order, but you'll see why it's here. New York Times bestseller, Margaret Macmillan. She's like the great granddaughter of David Lloyd George. She went through the personal papers of these cats to write this book. This is Paris
Yeah.
1919, about the
The
Paris Peace
brilliant,
Treaty,
brilliant
6 months
report.
that changed the world. If you read all the way to the end, you got this whole section on Palestine, bro. What's going on here? What are these people doing in Palestine? Why are they deciding this?
No,
Were they
look, Balfour
involved in World War
Declaration.
One?
No, Theodore
Well,
Herzl. Look at
I
that.
know it's
Weizmann. Oh man,
all right. So
this is juicy.
so hold on a second, because Weitzman and Herzl were writing back and forth with Cecil Rhodes, admiring his apartheid operation in South Africa. There might be something going on here,
Yeah,
Tony.
because they have to somehow gain a majority, or at least with a population, to create the sort of apartheid conditions by which they can justify their rule
Well, wait,
over this land.
wait till we get to 1948, Nelson
Mm,
Rockefeller's office. But we're going to
that's
start
true.
here. This is Palestine. This is chapter 28, and this is page 410 in the book Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. At the end of February 1919, a middle-aged British research chemist wrote to his wife from Paris. Yesterday, the 27th of February at 3:30 p.m. at the Cour d'Orsay, Quai d'Orsay, Quai d'Orsay. I don't speak French. There took place a historic
Yeah,
session. He told her it was a marvelous monument, the triumph of my life, triumphant of my life. Chaim Weizmann, who had been the Supreme Council with the deputation of fellow Zionists to make the case for a Jewish home in Palestine. So this is going on in 1919. This is not Hitler, post-Hitler era. He did bad stuff and they need a country. This was being baked in for decades and decades and decades before it popped off, right? So at first, Zionism, the struggle for a Jewish homeland, perhaps even a Jewish state where Jews could be in a majority.
Majority. See, that's a key. That's still
they got to colonize. Yeah. So
right.
All right. So by 1900, however, much had changed. Nationalism. The last Jewish nationalist question, wasn't that the Moses Hess book? Something about nationalism here, working with the British to make this happen back in 1862. Yes. All right. So here, the same plan, same people, just different generation, continuing. By 1900, however, much had changed in nationalism, which itself had helped to produce Zionism, which had also brought fresh dangers to the Jews when other nationalists turned a suspicious eye on the minorities among them. There was a bewildering, horrifying resurgence of the old dark European hatred for Jews, even integrated secular Jews, right? So that starts to build. This is Paris 1919 we're reading from. So it talks all about Theodor Herzl, the World Zionist Congress. Remember, Lord Rothschild, the Balfour Declaration is on behalf of the Zionists. Britain is giving them Palestine. That's 1917, right? So if you go over here, it continues to build. There's Lord Rothschild mentioned in Paris 1919, right? Milner authored the Balfour Declaration. What's my proof? Let's go to balfour100.com and let's look at the drafts of the declaration, because we're educated adults. Balfour100.com. We click right here, declaration. Look, 67 words that led to the creation of the state of Israel. Interesting. This is all pre-Hitler. This is pre-World War II. This is pre what most people on Twitter are educated to know.
Yeah, that's correct.
So let's get smarter than the people on Twitter. Here's Lord Rothschild's draft of 18 July 1917. His Majesty's government, this is what he wants. His Majesty's government accepts the principle that Palestine should be reconstituted as a national home for the Jewish people, and His Majesty government will use its best endeavors to secure the achievement of this object and will discuss the necessary methods and means with the Zionist organization. Here's the official history. Many of history's great documents and speeches, not to mention works of art, literature, and music, were repeatedly modified and refashioned before they were finalized. So it was that on June 19th, 1917, British government officials led by Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, asked Zionist leaders Chaim Weizmann and Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, the guy that rides the tortoise in that picture where he's riding a giant tortoise, that's him. He's a zoologist, by the way. You can check that. To produce a draft formulation for British support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which the cabinet would consider. The Zionists, along with sympathetic British officials, had already been working on the contours of such a statement. Among those involved were Mark Sykes, Ronald Graham, a whole bunch of other people that aren't actually in the letters. The version seen here, dated 18 July 1917, is known as Lord Rothschild's draft. It was based on a rather long and detailed 12 July working draft by the Zionists. Okay, so we've established this is draft one, Lord Rothschild's draft. Here's Arthur Balfour's draft. Here's Lord Milner's draft. Here's Milner and Amory's draft. And here's the actual declaration. So here's Lord Milner. He has a draft. He made some changes, but it's pretty much the same. It's all explained here on Balfour100.com. You can read it for yourself. Here's the Milner Amory. Leo Amory was also part of Cecil Rhodes' Roundtable. It's a little bit more verbose. They want a national home for the Jewish race and will facilitate to its best endeavor. So it's just a little wordsmithing going on in these various drafts. And then you get to the final draft, and it looks like this. Foreign Office, November 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors. It's like verbatim, right? So it's a little bit more wordsmith. It's an official document, but now you understand the history and nature of that. But wait, as Ron Popeil would say, there's more. Arthur Balfour of the Balfour Declaration, he has, I think it's his daughter, maybe it's his niece, Blanche Balfour Dugdale. And her husband, Edgar Dugdale, are responsible for bringing Hitler's book Mein Kampf into English in 1925. That's right. That's a weird Zionist connection, don't you think, Tony? That the people who bring us that also brought us the Mein Kampf book that fails to mention the Rothschilds that we were just talking about. Like if Hitler had a thing for Jewish bankers and he doesn't name them, how's he not know? I don't understand. There's a lot of conundrums.
Seems like they're
when you look into
interested
these
in
things.
sort of fascistic style state.
A lot of
top
interesting
down.
things. So now going back to Margaret Macmillan's 1919,
Actually, an ethnically idealized state, because that's what the Jewish state represents. That they argue that their ethnic Jews are the ones that have the right to it. Of course, that gets messy if you consider Gilad Atzmon's work. But anyways, good.
So that's 1917. Let's go back to 1906. Balfour met Weitzman for the first time in 1906. They're talking about a Jewish form of patriotism was unique. Yeah. Here's David Lloyd George, the great grandfather of the woman writing this book in the story, right? This is all about British Israelism, the British Israel World Federation, because the British Empire is built on the British royal family and they get their royalness and their power to be kings and queens from the Bible. So they have crossover interests, these groups, over time. And are they helping the people who they subjugate in all cases? No, they're not. Jews, Christians, Muslims, all getting short shrift on this because ruling elites who are independent of ideologies like kindness and freedom and these sort of things that we like to practice as individuals, they see that as antithetical to their existence. Read Machiavelli if you don't understand this, which is why we have an intermission tonight, so you can understand the people that are up to this kind of skullduggery. So that's a book. I also, let me just read this from the last, this is page 420. No decision was made on Palestine that day or for months to come, and it barely came up at any subsequent meetings of the peace conference. As so often happened in Paris, the issue that was the cause increasing trouble over the years was scarcely considered at all. Quote, the Palestinians are very bitter over the Balfour Declaration, end quote, reported an American intelligence officer in 1917. Quote, they are convinced that the Zionist leaders wish and intend to create a distinctly Jewish community, and they believe that if Zionism proves to be a success, their country will be lost to them. What country? Palestine, a country that doesn't exist today, right? Technically, I don't know, international law, maybe it does, but what I just saw on the news, it doesn't seem like that country exists anymore. To them, so their country will be lost to them, even though their religious and political rights will be protected. Zionist leaders to see Palestine as somehow empty if the Zionists do not go there, said Sykes firmly, Sykes-Picot Treaty. Quote, someone will, nature abhors a vacuum, end quote. A British Zionist is supposed to have coined the phrase, quote, the land without people for the people without land, end quote. So it goes on to describe Herzl and Weizmann and their activities in the creation of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, which is what we were just learning about in that clip on the early immigration, the proto-immigration for that endeavor. So now that we've got that book that I didn't plan to use on the record.
I have, you have another, yeah, go ahead. And then
I got two more in the stockpile here. This one doesn't have a very good cover. Let's zoom out. It's just green. Is it green with envy? I don't know. Let's see. It's called The Rothschilds and the Land of Israel. Can you see that? Rothschilds and Land of Israel. It's by Simon Schama. And he is neither anti-Semitic nor a conspiracy theorist. Here is, it's called Two Rothschilds and the Land of Israel. I'm sorry, that's the whole cover. And there's Baron Rothschild. And this is published in 1978, so it's prior to the internet. You have a whole table of contents here. Let me just get to the key quotes so we can get to the other exhibits. I could have chosen cheaper farmers, but instead I chose Jewish ones. Edmund de Rothschild, 1930. So he's a farmer.
That's pretty clever.
Here we go. The two worlds of the dispersion. Oh, sorry, wrong button. There we go. In 1882, the year in which Baron Edmund de Rothschild first provided succor for the embryonic settlements in Palestine, is generally reckoned to be a turning point in Jewish history. They present two decidedly opposite tableaux, that of the Jew as victor and that of the Jew as victim. So they're considering these two worlds that are smashed together. And there's a mention on the next page of Rothschild and his gang. And then there's some mentions over here of the protests of a deputation of Jewish notables. Alexander III insisted that the pogroms had been the work of anarchists, and that in any case, the Jews had invited such misfortunes by their exploitation of Christian and Russians. I don't know about that quote, but I had that highlighted. Here's the other Baron Alphonse de Rothschild. So you have some French Rothschilds, you have some English Rothschilds. Not all Rothschilds were interested in the colonization of Palestine. Let's see. I want to get to the quote, which is probably the next one. So we're getting up to the year 1880. And I remembered seeing this phrase. So I'll just read it out loud. The group of settlers who founded Rishon LeZion, first in Zion. That's what this settlement was called. Okay. This is 1880 and 1881. The first clip that we have tonight on the Israeli-Palestine conflict comes from Rishon LeZion, the place that was formerly the settlement, the first settlement of Baron Edmund de Rothschild. And because I dumped a bunch of clips on LD, I want to make sure that I have, here it is right here.
If I can,
I got
quick,
it.
Oh, you got it?
I got you.
No, it's this one. Boom.
I want to add a little quick context.
Go ahead. Add a little quick context.
This is Theodore Herzl's Moshel and Zionist anti-Semitism. I think you'll get a sort of understanding of the two different types of Jews that are trying to be sort of portrayed or painted in the late 19th century in order to sort of demonstrate the type of Jew that they idealize and would like to emigrate to to Israel at this point. So Herzl's Moshel refers to a virulently anti-Semitic diatribe or screed entitled Moshel. It was penned by Theodore Herzl and published in 1897, a little over a month after the conclusion of the first Zionist Congress. The text appeared in his newspaper Die Welt, which was to become the principal outlet for the Zionist movement down to 1914. It is often taken since its publication to be emblematic of an anti-Semitic strain of thinking in Zionism. Now I want to go down here. The essential distinction between a quote-unquote good, and a quote-unquote bad Jew is a lack of honor in the latter. It is the hallmark of the Moshel that when poor, he behaves as a quote-unquote despicable shoner. And if a parvenu, he becomes into riches, he proves to be an even more detestable show-off, a crafty profit-seeker, engaged in dirty deals, who cringes in adversity rather than bearing up stoically under persecution. Good Jews have always been aware of and tolerated, even helped, this kind of spineless, repressed, and shabby fellow. Going down to the end here, it says, it is the Moshel who has given currency to the catchphrase about Zionist Jews being anti-Semitic, thereby conniving with anti-Semites themselves. The pulpits of synagogues should be cleansed of rabbis who protest about Zionism. The opponents of Zionism should be treated as what they are, enemies, the quote-unquote motley crew of profit seekers, Jewish financiers, with skeletons in their closet, blackmailing Jewish journalists who accept bribes to keep quiet about misdoings, Jewish lawyers who serve a clientele operating on the edges of the law, along with the pinko politicians, pious hypocrites, shady businessmen, and the like. Elsewhere in his writings, Herzl described opponents of the Zionism he was proposing as quote-unquote Jewish vermin. If it puzzles Jews how they could have come to be confused with the Moshel when the two types have always felt antipathy for each other, and if Jews are perplexed as to how this kind of Jew, whom Herzl and anti-Semites find repulsive, came to be part of Jewry, then perhaps Herzl speculates the explanation may be that sometime in the distant past, Jews suffered from racial contamination. I mean, you can see the incredible racism, the setting the stage for this idea of the type of Jew that should be the one to immigrate to Palestine. Anyone that is against the aspirations of Zionism should be put down immediately. This is from their own Jewish, or Zionist, I should say, leadership. This is why there are so many factions, at least there was, although there are certainly minority factions. A Hasidic community was one for a long time until they gained citizenship in Israel, was very much outspoken against Zionism for this reason, because you can find in kind of Weizmann, you can find Theodor Herzl, and a number of other early Jewish Zionist thought leaders, this sort of inherent anti-Semitism against their own kind, because they worship the sort of secular Jew, and as Jew of the nation state, a Jew of the polis, like the one that is not very much a religious Jew in any sense. Hence why Theodor Herzl recognized this early on in the late 19th century and said, and after the meeting of the first Jewish Congress, the first Zionist Congress, that we need to stamp this out. Within European Jewry, we need to go out, and that's why he wrote this diatribe called the Moshel or whatever, in which case to, represent to those who have aspirations and sympathies to Zionism that we need to stamp out any sort of anti-Semitic sentiment within their own communities. It's very important to understand that context of how much they needed to, in a way, condition their own religious
audience.
To accept a nation state of this caliber, and then you begin the aliyahs, and it moves from there.
All right, LD, let's roll this Forbes breaking news clip. It's going to show footage emerges of Rishon LeZion, Israel, after deadly surprise attack. And then we're going to go right back to this book on the creation of Rishon LeZion and the Rothschild settlements in Palestine, which later became Israel. You're seeing wreckage. That's a rocket that appears to have hit the street. You might have a tip casing under that asphalt. A lot of sand there. It doesn't look like they have deep roads. Burned out cars in the street. More shocked cars from the explosion. Safety and first responders on the scene. Double-decker bus. Security people in the frame. Now it's a hypothesis that's from a rocket, because I heard they sent thousands of rockets, but that could also be a car bomb. That type of holes is similar to that type of explosion. And windows blown out. No, and that big truck is not double decker. That's a fire truck. Sorry. All right, go ahead. Pull that shrapnel all over the car there. All right. All right. So Hamas allegedly attacked that part of Israel. That was some footage. That was the first piece of footage I saw about the event. Now let's go back to the book. This is from 1978, right? Let's just double check what decade we're over there. 1978 by Simon Schama, and it's called Two Rothschilds and the Land of Israel. And first American edition is what I'm reading from. This is from page 90. These are the Rothschild settlements in Palestine, which later became Israel, but this is 1880. Rothschild settlements colonizing Palestine. It's called The Experiment. 1887 to 1899 we're up to in the timeline. Monsieur de Rothschild wishes at any price to prevent them, the settlers at Rishon LeZion, from returning to Russia. He absolutely desires that they establish themselves whatever the cost. Since anti-Semitism will not decrease, he believes it is necessary to think of the future, and charges me to particularly impress upon you the importance he attaches to the foundation of a pied-à-terre in Palestine. So they start kibbutzing, they start farming, and there's outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Russia and Germany and Poland to drive people to Palestine, which is clearly being colonized and filled up way before those clips we even saw in the 1920s and 30s. If on social Darwin grounds, the colonies were provided with finance, but sparingly, the settlers might complain with some justification that their progress beyond the most rudimentary forms of indigenous agriculture had been deliberately impaired. So it was important to keep funding these operations from afar. Now, interestingly, one of the front organizations used to fund these Rothschild projects in Palestine, Tony, It's an interesting connection to the American Civil War. It's
Hmm. But the
it's a group of
chairman for the
brothers. Well, I mean, I do have a book on it. Hold on.
Democratic National Committee, like Auguste Beaumont.
This is a prestigious coffee table book. It's huge. So I gotta zoom out. Let's see. It's called Lincoln and the Jews: A History, and Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Chappell. No relation to Dave, apparently. And it was right about this time that there was a section in here about that banking house. And I thought I had highlighted it or marked it, but I probably took the page marker out of here. A lot of interesting artifacts are in here. Oh, I found it. I found it. Oh, there's many pages marked in here. Hold on. There's a chronology. Let's go to this one here because facts matter. And we're going to bump into a fact. Let's see. This is Lincoln's work over here. Is this? Sorry, I should have. The show is not planned out in advance. And there's a document in here from the banking brothers of the house that the Confederates also worked through.
Hmm.
And
Solomon de Rothschild, huh?
yeah, but the problem is there's too many good pieces of information in this book. And once you move a bookmark, then you don't find the original place where. Oh
What
wait,
was
there's
their what
more.
was their
But wait,
banking?
there's more. Hold on.
What
There's
was the
more.
banking? Okay.
There's more cards in here. So mentions John Ruskin at some point. I wanted to find, but it's not easy. I'll find it during the next clip. That's all I'll do. We'll do it live. I just foreshadowed a book that I didn't plan on showing. That's all. And then we'll get that banking house on the record because they participated in the proto colonization of Israel, and this is all about August Belmont. We already talked about him, but I'm going to go back to that page. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. There is one more book before we get out of Simon Shama's book. There were these parts. How does it end, Tony? Well, it ends with the creation of the state of Israel. I know it's a spoiler alert for this book, but here in 1957, here's a letter from Dorothy de Rothschild, the widow of James de Rothschild, who was the financier of the Knesset and the political Congress building for Israel and
Yep.
these sort of things. So this is 1957. She's writing to the Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel that she helped to put into power.
It'd be
My
like Ben
father,
Gurion at that time or
yeah,
something like
this
that.
is so she gets a response back from Ben Gurion. That's why I'm showing you this.
Mhm.
My father began his colonization work in Israel 75 years ago. Tony, can
Oh
you do math live on the show?
well,
I'm
so
asking for a friend because this is
1957, so we're back in
yours.
the
Yeah, you do the math.
late
Dorothy
19th
de
century.
Rothschild, right there,
Yeah. Yeah.
1957.
Yeah.
My father began his colonization work in Israel 75 years ago.
1882. Oh,
Okay. There might be, well, it's just her father's colonization. There might be other Rothschild colonization prior to 1882 in examples and evidence yet to be entered into this discussion.
well, yeah, I
So
mean, it
she,
goes back to like 1828 or something like that. Anyways, good.
so she writes, and then Ben Gurion writes back, 1957. Now, how many days later? Let's see. Someone like, so she writes July 15th, 1957. July 23rd, 1957, Ben Gurion's like, hey, dear Mrs. Rothschild, we have received the stuff you set up for us and we're running your government for you, right? This is like a corporation for
Yeah.
that situation, right? So anyway, we'll get into how Ben Gurion gets his country because it's in this book. We're going to get to that in a second, in a couple clips. But let's go back to evidence and
To do with
artifacts
blackmail.
that were planned for this episode. And it looks like one of these. Rothschild and early Jewish colonization. Here's a postcard from 1894. Come on over to Palestine. Look, Tony, we got good things growing. They're using propaganda, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is pre-Bernays. So
Yeah.
you might say, who wrote this book, right?
That
What
in a
kind of
place
credibility?
that's notoriously infertile, this does not have the best soil by any means. I'm not to say there aren't parts of it that is amenable to certain sort of products, but
So
my
this is
God,
brought
like olives,
this book on Rothschild and early Jewish colonization in Palestine
not
is
much
brought to
arable land.
you by the haters over at Hebrew University. Okay. So this is not unknown in the realm of politics that we're talking to. So introduction, the pre-Rothschild years, sporadic development.
Yeah.
The first overtures, 1881. You know, that's what we just learned about. Here's 1882. They got it in process. Then they had a couple different phases.
Deepening ties.
Then they
yeah.
have the administration, setting up the hierarchy. You know, all these sort of things. This is a year. This is printed year 2000. This is 23 years old. Hebrew University Magnus Press, printed in Israel, right there. So this is not some conspiracy theory book, and this is dismissed as, you know.
The pre-settlement, the sporadic settlements are very important. So Rothschild early investment that goes back to the very early 20th, or excuse me, 19th century, very early 1800s, in other words, is very important because they were essentially buying up the arable land and buying and sort of setting the precedent for the context for the participation of aliyahs and in the essentially manifesting the sort of question that would then become the later Zionist movement. Because like now they're like, look, we have a foothold. There are some Jewish settlements now. There are some sort of like sporadic investment by the most powerful banking family of Europe. So like that says like, look, there's already people there. Now we can start building a propaganda campaign around the necessity to bring those people over. Otherwise, there wasn't enough, I think, Jewish population in Palestine at the time to justify.
Which is why they had to move all these people there over 100 years, Tony.
That's why they had this sort of, they actually was prudent to, exhort from like the Rothschilds and other, wealthy Jewish European bankers and or Jewish bourgeoisie, if you will, to help cultivate, metaphorically speaking, the conditions by which immigration would be possible. But that goes before the late 19th century, where you start really seeing this manifest and you see it as being this massive sort of international movement, really speaking, because the Jews were, since the diaspora, all over the place, technically, according to their own tradition.
So the list of maps included in this include a map of Rishon LeZion in 1890. And then also it became a winery, Tony, which is, good for business. And then we have Rothschild's project outside his colonies. His colonies. Let's go to page 263 and see what that looks like. You whet my appetite right there. That looks like this. Oh, he's got projects outside his colonies, huh? These are his colonies.
That's what I'm
He's
saying.
on the face of the money. His name's on the streets. His later generations built the Capitol building, right? So I'm just saying, let's take a look. What kind of he's got other activities. He's got production resources, employment, public services, development projects, legal aid.
How did they negotiate with the Ottomans?
It's almost like they're colonizing a country back in the 1890s, Tony.
Yeah, I mean, the curious factor is like, how were they negotiating with the Ottoman Empire at this time, the Turks, in other words?
I have an answer to that question. That's
fascinating, because like, how could they? There wasn't much infrastructure development in that region to begin with, because there wasn't much arable land. There wasn't much reason to have industry. It was a sort of a hot.
Here's Gaza. Isn't that where something's going on this week? But it says Rothschild's projects outside his colonies, page 263. And so, yeah, there's something to this. It's not conspiracy theory. And I think a lot of people are behind on their reading. And it'd be really great if we can catch up together before World War III pops off, because
there'd be no Jews that would ever have immigrated there if it wasn't for the conditions or the foundations being laid by wealthy financiers for
these guys right here, Tony. The Erlanger firm. A Hovai Zion leader in Paris. So the Erlanger firm does business with the Confederacy on behalf of the Rothschilds. And here the Rothschilds are using that same firm to colonize Palestine on behalf of the French Rothschilds.
I thought Auguste Belmont. I guess he was just the financier in America.
Erlanger. So now, if you talk for 10 seconds, I'm going to go to the other book and look up Erlanger, because that's a serious accusation if they funded the Confederacy. So let's look.
Well, I mean, is Erlanger a financier? Because I thought Auguste Belmont, the house like that, they were the financier in the South that was being the liaison between the Rothschild interest and, the Democratic Party of the South. That's why he was chairman of the Democratic National Committee. So that's what's, I'm curious to see like how many different because let me bring it up real quick. It's like how many different types of financiers
right here. Here you go. I got it. I have it in the brain. The Erlanger firm Emil Erlanger and Company,
Oh, the
Confederate
cotton
Cotton
bonds.
Bonds,
I see.
right?
Okay, so that's the way in which I see. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And there's evidence. So these are part of the Rothschild charities, so
Yeah,
they're
and
using the
John
Palestine
Slidell.
1835 Palestine colonization in 1829. So if we just went to this reference,
And so August
and
Belmont, like Caroline Slidell Perry, that's part they're
yep.
married. So like Slidell, you have that as the
Well,
parent
yeah, because
relationship there
Solomon
because
de
that's
Rothschild stayed with them, and they're all
so
up
it's
in
all
the.
interconnected. Yeah, I see now.
So here's an example. This is what I'm going to show you is a newspaper article. I know that Dan Dix likely has this article. Maybe we should have him on the show. He could show us the actual artifact. This comes from, let me press this button so you see. The Columbian Star and Christian Index, volumes 1 and 2. So this was a publication. If I open this, a new tab, we can look at the cover. You can see it's a publication of all the stuff in one volume for the year, right? So this is 1829. You see right here, 1829. We're searching inside this book, and it contains a bunch of prints from the newspaper that were printed that year. Okay. So now we're going to go back to the Google book link, and this is page 352. Let me see if I can get it to open in a new tab. No, it won't. So here's the entire article. It's page 352 in this Columbian Star Index. And if I control plus, we can get to this part of the article. So if we go up to find the title, where is it? They're written in italics usually. The point is, here's the end of the article. It's a report. I'm not saying the report is true, but if something printed back then ends up being true later, I would take note of it. So this is 1829. If we know in 1881 and later there was colonization of Palestine by this international banking family, and the claim is made in 1829, there's a good chance that the agenda at least existed that early, even if they didn't succeed in buying off the Sultan. Because if we can make it.
Yeah, right. That's oh yeah, I remember this.
I lost it. Hold on.
Yeah, that's the only problem. It's control.
It is stated that Baron Rothschild, the celebrated London Jewish banker, is about to purchase all Palestine, the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, as a kingdom for the Jews over whom he is to be king.
Right. I remember we
Rothschild.
got that quote on many times, but the question is, I wonder how. When
So
what year was that?
1829.
Yeah, so I
And
thought it
here
went
it
back
is
to around
in the
1820,
paper. So this is like,
okay.
here it is in the paper, and they have a whole story about it. So I'm not saying
So
like
I wonder,
these people could be crackpots, but how did they get this right 50 years early? If there's not something to it. And there's also an 1835 reference, which is independent of this. Let me see if I can find. There's also 1829.
and the fact that there's Jewish development, Rothschild development
right
specifically in the mid to late 19th century shows they either struck a deal with the Ottoman Turks
this
or
is the one that Dan has.
did it through clandestine means.
All right. So I wanted to buy this newspaper. I didn't
possible.
have the ka-ching at the time, but one of my colleagues, Dan, he's got the actual newspaper because he bought it from rare and early newspapers. We all knew about it, but Dan got the artifact.
Press for truth, right, Dan Dick?
Well played, press for truth. Well played. We're gonna have to get Dan on the show. So this is the Niles Weekly Register from November 28th, 1829. This is a different publication in the same year with a very similar claim. Could be coming from the same source, right? But let's just check it out because I'm not saying this is true.
They're claiming pecuniary distress of the Sultan.
I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is an evidentiary artifact that exists that makes a claim that later turns out to be really important in world history. So let's check it out. Niles Weekly Register, Baltimore, November 28th, 1829. One of the articles within is headed Jerusalem with the text beginning, quote, "There is a report that the Rothschilds have purchased Jerusalem. We see nothing improbable that in the pecuniary distress of the Sultan," that means the monetary distress, pecunia, pecuniare, it's a Latin word for money, and with more, ending with, quote, "The Sultan is in great difficulty. Baron Rothschild was proceeding to Constantinople, and a second rebuilding of the temple is not among the most strange things expected in these strange times by some of the Jews." So I'm not saying that's true. could be written by a crackpot. But now we got these two crackpot articles, both from 1829, that we can find today. Many more might have existed and never got cataloged on the interwebs. So we have to take them seriously and conduct an investigation. These claims, some of them are specious. Some of these, and here's the full text. You can click in and you can read the whole article, and there's, quite a bit to it. And thank you, the people that collect such rare newspapers, because right here, just like screenshot that's piece of history that is inconvenient to anybody's narrative on the world stage. They don't want you to know how the world has been constructed, because if you don't know what's going on out there, you're always going to be making the wrong moves.
This is interesting. I mean, maybe this could be just tangential and not related, but should this be noted that around the time a lot of those side projects that the Rothschilds are up to as far as infrastructure in Israel, I mean, you have this situation with what's called the Ottoman public debt. The empire previously not taken foreign loans, but with the demands of the Crimean War, anything going on, Ukraine, Crimean, Russian area, anyways, around the Black Sea, the empire took its first loans in 1854. The public debt quickly ballooned, becoming larger than any other European nations. The Panic of 1873 depressed the economy, as followed by poor harvests. The Ottomans found themselves unable to repay the loans and so defaulted on their debt in 1875. The Ottomans owed their loans to various European countries and their citizens, who were deeply upset at the failure of their investment and lobbied their governments to intervene. The effort became the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which grew to become a major and independent arm of the Ottoman bureaucracy, whose sole goal was providing returns to European creditors. Just wondering if they were able to leverage the fact that the Ottoman Empire went in such great debt over the Crimean War, and like the Rothschilds, that is, in order to gain a foothold for infrastructure development in those areas. That's just me speaking out loud. Open-ended questions.
To read this into the record, it reads, Jerusalem. There is a report that the Rothschilds have purchased Jerusalem. We see nothing improbable in that. In the pecuniary stress of the Sultan, he should
pecuniary stress, financial
But here's
distress,
the part that, so the Rothschilds, are wealthy beyond desire, perhaps even of avarice, and so situated, it is quite reasonable to suppose that they might seek something else to gratify their ambition that shall produce most important effect, if secured in the possession, and which may be brought about by money. They might instantly, as it were, gather a large nation together, soon to become capable of defending itself and having a wonderful influence over the commerce and condition of the East, rendering Judea again the place of deposit of a large portion of the wealth of the ancient world. To the Sultan, the country is of no great value, but in the hands of the Jews, directed by such men as the Rothschilds, what might it not become, and in a short period of time? ? This is 1829. This article really ran in the newspaper. It might be part of history that people should consider before they go off half-cocked, claiming genocide is good for one side. I don't know. Maybe.
Yep.
Maybe no genocide. Can we get to that point?
Yep.
Is there a point? There is a point. And there's this piece of evidence that we will now enter into the record. It's been on this show before. Many of you know it. Many of you don't. So we're going to play it again, as it were, in the Humphrey Bogart sense. Now, this book is titled The Witness Tree. It is written as a novel because it's written from intelligence documents and interviews, and it's brought into a narrative so people would actually consume it. And that is explained in the appendix after you read the book. Should you want to read the book, it looks like this. And it deals with a couple interesting things. The Dulles brothers had a sister, and she dated somebody that the Dulles brothers didn't like. He might have been a Zionist, and they might have killed him. That might have happened back in January 1934. And there's some history to that. But I'm going for what's at the end of the book. I don't want to spoil the story. So let's go back to not April 1947. We got to go a little bit further in. November 22nd, 1947. Now, if I just cover up and say that date, what is this? What is that? Does anyone know that date? November 22nd? It's a famous day in American history. But we're not talking about Dallas in 1963. We're talking about New York in 1947. This is about two Mossad agents, proto-Mossad agents, that go up to Rockefeller Center and Elam and Misha, they're going to blackmail Nelson Rockefeller. What do you think is going to happen here? Misha cleared his throat. Is he expecting us? He, meaning Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller. He had a phone call from Jerusalem to get him thinking. So they're headed up to his office. He welcomes them in. Hello, fellas, come on in. Nelson Rockefeller said easily, his eyes cool. Craggily handsome, a large forehead and swept back hair, hunched slightly at the shoulders. Rockefeller wore a wintry smile that vanished when Elam only nodded and kept moving to an armchair near the desk. Misha took the second chair, the dossier on his knee. It's a momentum game, Shiloh had told him. That's his Mossad trainer. Welcome, gentlemen, Rockefeller said. Can I offer you a drink? We don't drink, Elam said, and then after a pause, thank you. You have some idea what this is about? Rockefeller, who was in his shirt sleeves, frowned slightly. No, I had a call, but it didn't make any sense to me. Something about some papers. Yes, that's why we contacted your lawyer, Mr. Dulles. He's aware of the urgency of this matter, Elam said. God, he's calm, Misha thought. I'm fighting to keep the jitters out of my leg, and it's like he's ordering coffee. That made Rockefeller pause. Yeah, well, he wasn't available, meaning Dulles. He shifted slightly, waiting, his hospitality cooling. Elam held out his hand for the dossier, and Misha passed it over. This is the dossier that Jerusalem told you about, Elam explained. We've selected what amounts to the tip of the iceberg. It's interesting reading. He passed the folder over and then surprised Misha by standing up and walking to the big window beside Rockefeller's desk. So he's making a power move. He passes over this dossier, and now it starts to get interesting. The effect on Rockefeller was palpable. His eyes went from dossier to Elam and then to Misha, who consciously slowed his heart rate to something that didn't register on his temple with each pulse. Rockefeller's eyes hit the first page, the current account records from 1943. So that's when they're doing business with the Nazis. He turned slightly, involuntarily, toward Elam, his eyes moving as he read. Elam chose that moment to move slowly from the window to the drinks tray. There, cool, contained, he poured a large scotch for Rockefeller and then put the glass down and opened the file folder right beside the contents of the banking file. Turn the page, Elam said. Incredibly, Rockefeller did so. Next was to share the structure of a very well-known Swiss bank, courtesy of files no one next to God in Switzerland had ever seen, except the sweet young thing at the Zurich Public Registry Office who happened to know Israel Clipperman's son, meaning they had an inside spy honeypot. The next page is very informative. I think even a journalist might follow its implications. Rockefeller's hairline was suddenly shiny, rivets of perspiration gathering there. He turned the page and moved his glasses back with his finger. Page 3 was the record of a 1944 share transfer, a transfer tantamount to treason in any U.S. jurisdiction, complete with U.S. Treasury Department letterhead. Oh, geez. Rockefeller studied that one for a very long time. He looked up, ignoring the scotch. What's Ben Gurion want? You mean what Dorothy Rothschild wants? No, what's Ben Gurion want? Sorry, I was reading ahead. Elam was already reaching for the files. Votes, he said simply. Latin America votes for partition. We need all 15. You get us our votes. You say goodbye to this embarrassment. You can put the dossier right in your safe. Now, Rockefeller said nothing, turning page after page, some faster, some slower, the U.S. government documents giving him the most pause. At the last page, he closed the file. He ran a finger along his hairline. Misha expected a rant or a confession, but there was only silence and the dim sounds of the city beyond the plate glass. There was no stress in the man now. He raised his hand, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and slow, almost a recitation, not a reaction. You think you can walk in here and waltz off with the whole damn store? Rockefeller rolled the dossier into a cylinder. Fixing Elam, he began tapping the desktop with it. Condition 1. What I've seen never sees the light of day. Clear? That's understood. You got that right. If a word of this leaks out, you can tell Ben Gurion he'll be drilling for oil in his own backyard, because I'll personally guarantee that's the only place on the planet he'll find it. Understand that. Condition 2. You want your country? You get your country, but only if you give up your pound of flesh at Nuremberg. Not a single German banker goes on trial. Not one. Rockefeller stopped tapping the cylinder he'd made from the file and pointed it at Elam. But you don't get both. Vengeance or a homeland. That's the deal. I'll have to consult with Jerusalem about that, Elam said, his voice flat. Hey, consult all you want. Ben-Gurion has one card, Rockefeller said easily, and you just played it. Condition 3, the Nazis used as intelligence assets, they stay secret too. Total immunity. You don't touch them. You don't leak a word to the press. They're vanished. Lock, stock, and barrel. Clear? Now all Elam could do was nod. The room had gone silent except for the ticking clock on the big oak sideboard. You seem to be a sensible fellow. Good. Condition 4. You have your votes, but not a single American businessman or banker gets tarred with this. Not me, not anyone. We didn't win the goddamn war to put half of Wall Street on trial. Rockefeller raised his glass of scotch to his guest and said, thanks for coming. They then had to make a call. They waited 2 hours for Jerusalem to call back. And then on November 29th, 1947, wait, I don't want to skip too fast in the story, but they come to an agreement. So going forward, now they have a vote in the United Nations, and the votes for Latin America get pushed over, and the Zionists now have their state. Here's the story, but wait, because you were able to say that doesn't exist because it's all in a novel, let's go to the appendix over here. Here's a postscript. Let's put it on the record. This is a novel, but much of what you've just read is based on known fact, although the most intriguing elements are still classified. By the way, this book is written by John Loftus. We played a clip from him earlier. He's got the clearance to write these things, and he interviewed the Mossad agent that did the blackmailing. There were no Niemans, for instance, but Baron von Schroeder knew Foster Dulles well. Sullivan Cromwell record of involvement in cloaking Nazi assets is clear. Reuven Shiloh, the handler of those two spies, did in fact mastermind the Mossad from networks we recount. Eleanor did work with the Quakers, and her husband did get killed by the Dulles brothers. And he goes on. So it's just showing that the Haganah agent, John personally interviewed the Haganah agent who had firsthand knowledge of the blackmail of Nelson Rockefeller. Prescott Bush was indeed up to his eyeballs in the Union Bank affair with the Nazis, with the Harriman family, the Skull and Bones. There's a lot of layers to it, but this is the evidence. It's Loftus interviewed the Haganah agent that did it, or one of the guys in the room, right? So people won't read those documents, so you got to write, an interesting story called The Witness Tree, and it is. I mean, this is probably the only novel I've read in the past 15 years. I read it because of the intelligence information from which it was written. And if you think that that's all hunky-dory, that's how states come into existence and they should be defended and allowed to create genocide on a group of people they hold in an open-air concentration camp prison where they're not allowed to be armed, okay. But I want you to know the facts before you uphold that position because, genocide is something that I don't take lightly. They did a lot of it in the 20th century, mostly because of all these people I've talked about since noon today. It's not like I have a special talent. I'm not a polyglot. I don't know 5 languages. I'm limited to English. This is all in fucking English. But you guys are out watching Trump Apprentice for 10 years, right? We don't get our time back. People have wasted time. Now it's time to catch up or become catch up because these people are fixing to smash you like a bunch of fucking tomatoes. What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order.
There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions and we can get into the show and we can share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come